Welcome, everyone. So this is our July edition of our BVSSH Asia Pacific Community Meetup. And how exciting today that we are going to be talking about something that is fundamental to the system of work, something that is a ninja move, something that we think that all organizations need to be thinking about. And let me just share my screen. Can everyone see that now? Yeah, okay, great. So before I get into it, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodians of the land from which I am meeting with you on. And for me, that is the Wurundjeri people. And I'd like to pay my respects to their past and present and elders and anyone else with traditional origins that is joining us today. You might like to acknowledge your where you're from and where you're dialing in from in the chat. So feel free to drop that in. I am joined today by TeamForm from Sam and Eugene, as well as my partner in crime, Mark Payne from Sooner, Safer, Happier. And so we were thinking the other month around what might we share with you that would bring some value to the community, and a conversation that we keep having over and over and over again with organizations is solving some of the problems that I'm just about to get into. But we've kind of tackled this problem in a variety of different ways with different organizations, different contexts from a few different angles. So we're hoping to be able to share with you today all around the quarterly cadence. We'll start with the why. So kind of why are we even talking about this? What problems are we looking to solve? What is it? Because I think we all have heard kind of QBRs, big room planning, quarterly cadence, kind of what does that then mean? And then we'll talk about the how. So how might you get started? How might you think about this? What are some tips and tricks that we've learned along the way that you might find useful, helpful? And so we'll do a bit of a presentation for about 40 minutes, no more or so, and then make sure that we've got time for questions. So if there's something that comes up in your mind, whether it's an insight or an observation or a question, feel free to drop it in the chat as we go. Eugene will be helping us to not only be our Zoom bouncer, but to look at the chat, but we'll get to those at the end. So with that, then, I might get us started on the quarterly cadence in terms of kind of why are we talking about this. And when talking to leaders and organizations, the conversation that I have typically goes, "Hey, Maria, how's it going? You know what? I'm a bit embarrassed to admit, but I actually don't really know what my team is working on. I can't see it in one place. I don't know who is working on what. And there's things that are happening that I don't know. Invisible work. And then, you know what, Maria, my team is telling me that they're really busy and they don't have capacity and they're overworked and they have too much demand. There's too much work in the system. But I've given them my priorities and these are clear, but it doesn't seem to help. I'm actually not sure who's accountable for the work. And the team tells me that there are dependencies on other teams." Well, so my response then is the reason that this doesn't help is because the demands of the team that you've got, they're coming from more than one place. They're not just coming from you as their, direct manager or as their leader, often as the functional leader, but these priorities, this work is coming from other areas of the enterprise, other teams. And so how is the team actually meant to determine what is not the number one priority when there isn't alignment across these silos? This is limited flow. And then how can we then make the right decisions and then trade-offs on what the right work is and how to allocate the available capacity to deliver, which then often leads to the misalignment and the challenge in terms of the accountability. So if in that kind of story or in that role play, those are things that you're facing at the moment, then the next bit of the conversation that I then often have is, well, the target state pattern that we like to think about is the one that I'm sharing with you here. It's then how we like to think about the organization, and we like to think of the organization as a system, and it's got kind of two key parts to it. The first is, how do we organize and enable the work? So those are the blue bits on there, where we start from the strategic outcomes and we look at then what is then happening, year on year, quarter on quarter, and then, even the day-to-day tasks. So how do we get that connection, that golden thread of value? And then the second way we like to think about the system is then how do we organize capabilities and teams together? And what are your delivery vehicles for those outcomes? How might you then create some long-lived teams of value that have stable and fixed capacity? So that's kind of the pattern that is then in my head to try to start to tackle some of those challenges or those problem statements that I often have conversations about. And the three ways that we need to be thinking about this is actually from three persona perspectives. One is the enterprise. So there is going to be an executive team that is responsible for delivering the overall portfolio and strategy over a multi-year period and needs to get visibility on how is it that we're doing that. Then we've often got business units and portfolio kind of leaders. So every business unit leader needs to and is accountable and needs to be responsible for their own, strategy and the progress towards those goals. So how are we then doing that? And there's teams within that. And then we've got our teams of teams and the teams themselves. And so we've got then people leading teams that also then need to understand what's the connection, what are we working on, how does that then work? So when we're talking about the problems and the context of those problems, it's leaders at all levels. It's leaders at the enterprise, it's leaders at the BU, it's leaders at the value stream or team of team level. And from a system perspective, this is kind of how we need to start to think about it. So then the conversation typically then evolves to, okay, well, how might we then what does that then mean? Well, it then starts to think about, okay, well, what are the things that we can do right away? Well, let's start thinking about the right foundations. Let's think about then the system of work. And how might we create that visibility of the work? Because that's a problem at the moment. How might we create the right points along the way to make decisions? Because that's a challenge right now. How do we ensure continued alignment as we're delivering? And how do we make sure that the demand is then actually matched to the capacity, because we've got too much work in the system and it's overloaded? And so you'll see in a way to start to visualize what that might then look like from a system level is what we like to call the loop diagram, which is what you see here on the right hand side. And so there are a couple of components within that loop diagram, but what we're going to be doing a double click on today is just the quarterly cadence. So in order to solve or start to solve some of the problems that I was just explaining, we don't need to re-engineer the whole system. We can just focus on the quarterly cadence as a starting point. So let's get into it a little bit more, because in that quarterly cadence, it's part of a delivery model. There's some rhythms that need to be part of that. There's some artifacts that then help with that, like the living memo. And then there's, tooling and metrics that we need to be thinking about. So that's a little bit of the why and the landscape. Let's get into the what. So I might hand over now to Mark.
Thanks, Maria. Yeah, so when I'm working with organization or PMOs or those kind of things that are looking at either they've established their quarterly cadence, or they're looking to optimize their quarterly cadence, or they're actually looking to basically start from scratch because they've done something and it's not quite working, we tend to start to think about, well, what are the components or the things that they should be thinking about in the design and in the model? And as Maria touched on, like, the goal or the aspiration is it should be enterprise-wide. So you should be thinking about, over time, how do I bring the whole enterprise into the quarterly cadence? And if you're thinking enterprise and you know that's your end state outcome, one of the first steps you need to start thinking about is, how do you start visualizing the work and the outcomes? And so therefore, how are you connecting this strategy to the execution that's happening on the ground. So we're starting to think about how all the work ladders up, and we can start to create that traceability and visibility in there. If we've got the ability to see the work and to see how it's connected to strategy, the teams then themselves, those closest to the problems, the opportunities, the customer, etc., they should be able to start to then say, this is how we're going to start solving those things, and then start escalating for leaders. Here's what we need from you to be able to enable us to achieve those outcomes. But that should ultimately be based on clear direction from leadership. So we talk about what are the pivots and adjustments that we need to make for the upcoming quarter. We set the clear direction, and then the teams have the autonomy to be able to solve against those. We also then look at this as a key mechanism for change. If you can imagine every team within an organization working at a quarterly cadence in a different quarterly cadence can cause massive amounts of disruption to flow and the way things get done. So you should also think about this quarterly cadence as a key element to be able to bring those things together and enable some changes at all levels in your organization. And that change could be we continue, or we stop, or we pivot. So we can start to think about those. And then it's also the opportunity where it's not just a status update. This is actually about then bringing it together to start confirming that one, yes, we've made some decisions to either pivot, perish, or pursue. We're coming to the start of the quarter. We are working on the right things for the organization. So these macro elements, we start to then think about in terms of guiding principles. So how would we start to think about then setting up your system? So Maria, if I can get you to flip to the next slide. These are probably some starting point guiding principles that you can start to think about in your organization. The way that I like to think about these is the first two, the principles orient around value. So every organization, their goal should be the most value in the shortest time with the least effort. So these two principles orient around value, most value, and then the soonest time. So we're starting to think about, okay, within that quarterly cadence, how do we achieve those? The next two on the list then is about transparency. So how do we start to visualize that golden thread of value, being able to connect the work to the strategy, to the outcomes? And if we're able to visualize and create that transparency, connect it, we can now start to then make prioritization calls on end-to-end value. We can start trading things and starting to look at those more holistically. And then if you're enabling the conversation around value and transparency, ultimately then you're going to start building trust within the organization. And there's two elements around trust here. One is around creating trust at the team level. So I like to refer to it as aligned autonomy. So the teams know what they need to do, they're aligned on the direction, and then they're empowered to achieve what they need to. And it also allows us from a trust perspective to start to see that shift from output to outcome, and how can we start to bring in more hypothesis-driven work, bring in experimentation, think about design sprints, text bites, all those things that help us minimize the cheapest cost of value and start to challenge risk. So if we've got some macro elements and some guiding principles, on the next slide, Maria, personally, I've had some great success with this type of pattern at an organization that I worked with. And then working with other organizations, we're able to then start to adapt this pattern for setting up their quarterly cadence. It revolves around actually thinking about the enterprise. So we start to think about those personas that Maria touched on. So at the enterprise level, the BU and portfolio level, and then the value stream and the program level. But we start to think about the quarterly cadence moving through 4 macro steps: reflect, adapt, align, and act. And if you think about that reflect stage, this is an opportunity across the leadership level for the leaders to set direction. That's based on them actually taking a step back and actually looking at the performance of the organization, determining where the pivots and adjustments need to happen, and then as a leadership group, then setting the direction. If we've got that direction from leadership, it's then asking the teams and those closest to the work, how do they adapt to that direction? So this is now the ability for the teams to respond themselves. It's not about the work coming down from leadership. It's actually about the outcomes and the directions in the teams, then being able to identify the work. That enables us then to aggregate this information and now create portfolio views of where things are okay versus where we have blockers. And then this is what we then start to think about, well, what are the escalations by exception that we then need leadership to resolve for us? So that brings us then to the align stage, and this then allows leadership then to align again to deal with the escalations and blockers that have come through, be able to align then on have we got our capacity in the right spot to deliver against the right things for the right outcomes. And then we have approval then to start the quarter with an aligned portfolio that everyone's aligned to and backing in. And then the final stage there, if everyone's aligned on the direction, it then allows the teams to then build out their quarterly plans. They've got confidence in the direction that's been set, and then the teams are empowered to execute. At this point, I'll hand over to Eugene because there's probably some practical steps all within this that we can start tackling. Eugene, over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mark. That's an awesome blueprint. We use a similar pattern with all the organizations that we work with. As Maria mentioned up front, yeah, at TeamForm, we work with a lot of different types of industries, types of organizations, a lot of organizations who want to just get started. And so in the next 10 minutes, Sam and I hope to essentially give away all the learnings and insights that we've learned over the years on how to quickly get something like this up and running in your own organization. So if you go to the next slide, please. So first of all, I think one way that we like to think about a quarterly cadence is essentially it creates a powerful pattern interrupt within your organization. So a way to stop, to reflect, establish a common tempo, and really a vehicle for deploying change and ways for your teams and your organization to adapt in a way that's aligned, as Mark mentioned. And I think the other aspect here is that when we're trying to think about even small places to start is thinking about how can we foster as much transparency and alignment across teams as possible. So that's a recurring theme that I'll touch on in getting things off the ground. I think when we think about all the potential practices that you could deploy to make an impact, obviously there are a lot of different things that you could do. But from our perspective, this is one of the most powerful things that you can start to do. It's quick to get off the ground, but also helps you to expose the right conversations to have without imposing those conversations on the rest of the organization. So, and all of this is done in a way that helps you identify all those impediments, all those things that are blocking your team from reaching their full potential. So you see this visual here. This is a metaphor essentially as a way to think about the quarterly cadence as really the first domino to drop. And then once you actually start this pattern, then it starts to lead to some more prickly conversations and topics that you could be exposing within your organization. Things like funding models, things like work in progress, things like how we can optimize the system for the better delivery of value. So slide 13, please. So there are a couple different ways that you can approach it. We had some spirited conversations with the SSH team on what we should advocate for, but I'll expose these two different approaches because there are different pros and cons with both. And I think ultimately what you're looking for is where do you feel like would be the easiest place to start within your own organization? So first option would be shallow and broad, essentially trying to go as broad as you can across your organization, but as shallow as possible. In this example, we've highlighted just strategy and outcome. So thinking about trying to get as broad of a cross-section of the organization as you can, but start with something as non-controversial as something like just sharing out strategy and OKRs. This feels like a really sensible place to start if you can get multiple business units or across many value streams, just sharing strategy and goals, then it tends to start to open up those other questions and conversations that just lead you down the path of almost like organically trying to unblock teams and trying to limit work in progress and things like that. So it feels like a very non-controversial place to start. It's easy enough to get off the ground. So hopefully you don't get a lot of pushback for trying to just share out and be more transparent about what we're all trying to achieve so that you can help each other achieve those things. The second approach is more of like a narrow and deep approach. So say within a given value stream or business unit, actually setting up a quarterly cadence with a few more of these topics included. So yes, like strategy and outcomes and OKRs, but starting to go a few layers deeper, as deep as you can. And I think which approach you take is ultimately up to you, and where you feel like you have the most influence within your own organization. Ideally, it's lightweight enough to start, so you're not trying to get a lot of heavy process off the ground, but really starting off as small as you can, growing it over time and starting to slowly scale it across the organization. And Sam's going to touch on how you might be able to do this in a little bit. All right, next slide, please. One of the mindsets you can take on is treating a quarterly cadence as almost a modular product that you build out over time. We strongly advocate any organization trying to get this off the ground to not try to take this on by yourself and not try to implement this as a solo, as one person trying to get this off the ground, but more forming a cross-functional team that you would really align on shared outcomes, shared ownership, and really work together across as many functions as you can to be able to get something like this off the ground. Ideally, this is something you would kick off and actually form as a team, clarify not just why we're doing this, but how we're going to measure what success looks like. And the second thing is to be very transparent about what the product actually is. So why are we doing this? What outcomes are we working towards? What are we focused on now? Maybe we start with company goals, but in the future, we hope to start to move into other areas like funding and investment, risk, security, things like that. So actually having almost like a published backlog that's transparent about the process, and opening up feedback loops so you can actually measure whether this process itself is actually working within your organization, and being transparent about that feedback as well is something that we've seen really work within the organization, because then people can actually ask you as, say, a product owner of this process, say, hey, how can we actually help you make this process better? How can we best support from our side? Over time, yeah, you can publish release notes. Hey, these are the latest things that we're focused on. This is what we're trying to improve, and progressively connect additional data. But as Sam will pick up next, there are some really easy places to start. You don't need dedicated tooling to add. You can probably just start with the tools that you have. Sam, I'll pass it to you from here.
Yeah, thanks, Huge. So yeah, we want to make sure that you can get started quickly. We've seen companies spend years preparing for getting ready to launch a big bang QBR, and all that work, all that, those quarters and months leading up to the launch, you're not actually testing it with the real users. And so as Hugh just talked through, then picking a couple of areas and determining your approach, whether you go wide or deep in certain areas, can be really valuable, because once you launch, that's when you're going to start getting feedback. That's when you're going to hear from your users on that was too much content, it's duplicative, I'm doing that in other forums, and that's where you'll start learning. We want to talk, I guess, practically, how can you get started? Often people think I need to start a big RFP process and think about all the tools I need to go and achieve it. But as you said, when you think about some of the topics that we want to actually just have as a conversation as an organization, being the mission of the area of the value stream, why does it exist? The goals of the leader of this value stream or the team itself, those can be written down literally on a napkin. And you can start with a Confluence page or a Word or Google Doc. If we just go to the next slide, we'll share this in the chat and in the notes. But we're sharing an example together with SSH of what a living memo could look like. Again, some basic questions. Why? What is the version of the document? What is the purpose of the team that we're talking about? Why do they exist? How does the work that we're proposing align to the enterprise strategy? These are simple questions that leaders should be able to start to fill in. And again, you can break up this template and then progressively consider deploying it over time. If we just jump to the next slide, as you start to think about tooling, as our organizations are becoming more data-driven, we want to see this data democratized and made available. Often quarterly plans can happen in a vacuum. They can happen at the leadership level where people gather, have great discussions, robust discussions about what's in scope, out of scope, what are the goals. But if it's not made transparent to the teams that need to deliver, a lot of that can get lost in the conversations. And so when thinking about the tooling ecosystem, which could start with a Confluence page or a Word doc as your starting point, think about it from a user perspective. Who are the users that are filling it in? What help do they need? What different personas do you have operating? Is it a value stream lead that's focused on the work? Or is it a chapter lead that's focused on building a roadmap of capability development for an area of the organization like engineering? So think about it from a user-centric perspective. Think about how you open up the data. Could these Word documents, these Confluence pages, could they be open by default? For many organizations, that's a bit of a taboo topic, that it's visual. The strategy and our plans are made available to everyone. But we've seen very large organizations, with 100,000 odd people make their plans public and transparent. And it's amazing to see how all sorts of different people around the organization engage when they're given broader clarity. Also just think about how you can reduce effort. So, if people are writing goals down in this quarterly plan, how could you stop them having to write the same things down in other tools, or be able to reuse this data in other ways? It's always good to be able to take something away, or tell people that you're taking it away when you're replacing and deploying a new artifact for them to work with. So I might just bring this to life in a couple of ways through TeamForm. If we jump to the next slide, here's an example of where you've written down the goals, you've connected them to the teams, and you've made that visible to the organization. So anyone from the C-level to the individual developer or frontline worker can trace how their team connects through that golden thread of value up to the company's outcome. So think about how you can use that in communication when you're diagnosing issues. If that transparency is available, it allows people to quickly click and explore how things are connected, rather than scramble and pull together lots of PowerPoint slides. Just on the next slide, maybe this is a target state vision, and you can check out the slides later. But here we're bringing together those different data sources. Work in Jira, OKRs from wherever you write OKRs or metrics, dependencies, as well as the plan for the area. We want to make that transparent, allow for users to interact with it and collaborate on it. If you can make those plans visible, there's more likely that alignment will occur, trade-off discussions will happen, and you're more likely to achieve the end outcome. TeamForm takes a particular focus on the workforce and how we're organizing our people behind these outcomes. Once the outcomes are known, that's the first step and the most important step. Be clear on what are we actually working to achieve, and then you can think about who is there to work against those outcomes. If you just jump onto the next slide, Maria, I guess one of the biggest challenges is these cadences and forums occur, decisions are made but never communicated, and people will just keep doing their job. This is a very common conversation between, say, a value stream and a chapter lead. The value stream reaches out to the service design chapter to say, hey, you know, we want to get more people. This is done over a Teams message or an email thread. The chapter lead responds saying, hey, you got in first, so you get the best people. But there's no context of, was this actually the priority? Have we made trade-off decisions? If we just jump to the next slide, there's this balance of supply being your organization's greatest asset being the people, behind the demand being the value and the work. And this is a constant balance to be thinking about and maturing over time. So we really want to, by connecting people to the strategy and the work and being clear about what we're striving to achieve, I want to be able to untap the potential of the teams. We might pause there just to if you jump forward 2 slides. The quarterly cadence, as Maria and the team have talked through, it gives you a great opportunity to go and face into other organizational challenges. Often when you start talking and bringing a common language of the value and the work and aligning on that at the right levels of the organization, those impediments that have existed in the organization for years, being the funding model, risk management, shifting left on security, when you start having a common currency of value and alignment and the right mechanisms, of which a quarterly cadence can be that key mechanism, often this becomes a change vehicle that you can then go and face into these topics and build and iterate your forum over time. So I might pause there, but yeah, thanks for the opportunity to share.
Well, so I think to wrap it up, then thank you, Sam, Eugene, and Mark. Like, this is ultimately why the quarterly cadence is a ninja move, because it will help to alleviate those immediate, or start to answer the questions. It will start to resolve some of the visibility problems. It'll start to create some alignment. It will start to encourage the right conversations to be happening. So this ultimately is about decisions. This is not about having a big room planning event or just an event. Like, that's not what we're talking about in a quarterly cadence. Like, what we're talking about here is a mindset. This is about making work visible so that we can have an empowered team, so that they're accountable and that they're aligned, and that we're working kind of in lockstep. So it's a ninja move for that reason. And then the second reason, Sam, that you were just touching on, because it starts to then give you the basis for having other conversations like, well, we're set up in project teams at the moment, and we've got lots of we don't have all the right skills that we need. We've got dependencies across project teams. Well, how might we think about value streams? How might we organize differently? We don't have funding for things that we require, the things that are the most important things. So how do we talk about funding? How do we look at governance? It takes us too long to make a decision. How do we empower teams to make decisions? So that's the reason why it's the stealth ninja move. And so for the change agents that are in the audience, like, that is, it gives you then the opener to then be able to have, or the permission to basically have those other conversations. And maybe just the last thought before we open it up to questions is, and based on our collective experience, you're not going to get a quarterly cadence right the first time. The first one, it doesn't need to be perfect. You'll start to create some visibility of the work, like Eugene had mentioned. Just do that. That in itself is valuable. The second one won't be perfect either, but it'll start to help you drive the right conversations. It'll start to, you'll be able to think about priorities. And the third one, it'll feel a little less awkward. you know, the conversation is a little bit more in the flow. You've got the right information. You've got all the information. You can then start talking about demand and capacity matching. You're assessing doability of the work, and you're, you know, maybe starting to make trade-off calls. And then the fourth one will start to feel like you're a little bit more in the flow. And so the reason why it takes that long, you know, roughly 4 to 6 quarters, is because you actually have the chance to do it once every quarter. So there is the things that you're thinking about and preparing, those are your moments. So yeah, it's not going to be a 1 quarter and you have it all right stage, but it's a good place to start. So we might, I'll stop sharing now, and that way we can bring in questions, thoughts, reflections from everyone. Anything come through? I haven't been looking at the chat. Anything
Yeah,
come through
Maria,
the
a
chat?
couple great questions so far. Yeah, Zach, I don't know, Zach, if you're around or willing to just talk through your question.
Yeah, I've used SAFE in the past, and it's grown into everything that you've described here and a bit more. And it has its program increment, which is usually done in quarters. So what you're suggesting here is very similar to SAFE. Have you used it?
Sorry, is the question, have we used SAFE?
Yeah, so if I'm using quarterly cadence, why would I choose to use that rather than SAFE when there's a lot of SAFE practitioners and people are used to using it? You know, if you're going to sell to a large organization, a bank, and they go, well, we're using SAFE. Why should we get rid of SAFE and bring in this quarterly cadence system, which appears to be pretty much the same, but lacking in a few areas?
Anyone want to start to tackle that one? Mark, did you want to go for it first?
Yeah. So I am SAFE certified, but
I'm sorry to hear that. I hope you get better soon.
Yeah, but this isn't to say that it's safe or this, because most frameworks are actually trying to do something similar in this regard. And if you take a macro step back and ignore the frameworks themselves, if I just think about it from a cadence perspective, if you set an annual plan and you don't review it, there's a good chance you're going to go off track at some point. And if you're looking to make changes within that annual cadence, you've got to think about the teams on the ground and the frequency and how much disruptive change happens to them and how that can impact productivity. So with the organization that I was working in, where it took us about 4 to 6 quarters to get this going, for it to normalize. It was because we went through some of the things from previous frameworks, some of the things from our own learnings and those kind of things. But what we landed on was you did need every quarter a point to review. Are you on track against your plan? Based on how you're tracking against your plan, had anything shifted? And then therefore, how do leaders have the ability to move money around, change outcomes, those kind of things in a structured way? And then based on that, then allowing the teams then to form around those outcomes, and then to pivot.
Quarterly reviews, you know, in large companies, I assume you're looking at large companies, perhaps people who are at C-suite or director level. In large companies, they'll be doing quarterly reports to their analysts and their shareholders. So it ties in with that. So there's nothing new that they're doing. What it's taking the 6 periods to get through is human behavior having to change.
Correct. You only get one shot every quarter.
Yeah. So if you speak to people who go through a counseling session, it's usually 6 weeks in, 18 months, and 6 weeks out.
Correct.
It's the same thing for the business. So a lot of what you've got is very good, but if you were to invert the structure i.e. put strategy on the bottom, your value stream blueprints in the middle, and put the teams on top. There's new processes that you can bring in to get ideas from the team and to be able to have managers responding in the time that teams need the response to go through. So sometimes I code, sometimes I manage, and sometimes I strategize. If I'm coding and I've got a question that I want answered, I want the answer within 2 days. If I'm working for a large organization, it can take a month or 6 weeks for that answer to trickle up through the system and trickle back down. So the way that this could be improved is speeding up that decision-making process.
Yeah, and we didn't touch on it in this presentation, but if you think about the quarterly cadence being one cadence, there are other cadences and forums that actually sit around this that actually enables those things to happen as well.
Thank you very much. I'll try and catch you later.
Yep, sounds good.
Awesome.
Thanks for your
Thanks,
question,
Zach.
Zach. Yeah.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, Chris also had a couple of great questions. I think the second one we hear a lot, but yeah, Chris, can you please come off mute and just ask your questions?
Yeah, sure. And really enjoyed that interchange there with Zach and Mark, because in my head was like, are we saying that like all teams do like a big room planning? I noticed we didn't say that specifically. And then maybe getting a little bit down towards Bree's question as well. It's like, is this a whole organization motion that you stop and start on this moment, or is it like some teams might have a heavy quarterly cadence, other teams might have a very light one because they've reviewed their annual plan and it's all trucking? And how do you manage that variability? And I think Bree's question around offline was really also triggered a lot of thoughts too.
Did you want me to?
Yeah, I suppose I was going to say I got a lot of my answers from Zach's discussion above, and I think I'm really interested to see what Bree's question gets. So maybe we even get a Bree's question about the offline engagement, because the agenda of my question is like, what is it? How much pull does this put on the whole organization? Because obviously we don't all want to be in planning every quarter. A quarter comes around real fast. It's a huge investment to do planning. How do you minimize that impact on investment cost and people time as well? So interested to see how the offline elements work too. So maybe we can even go to Bree's question on that, because it was a really interesting discussion with Zach before. I think I got my question answered there.
Right.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk to that question. I've seen the big room planning within organization, lots of effort. Is it worth it? We don't know. But also the cascading OKRs, and I often think about what are we thinking about in a quarterly cadence? It's that those big things that are moving our organization in the right direction. And to Zach's point, we need to be able to know that that's our direction from a quarterly perspective, and teams are going to need to adjust, and that's more your team practice. But getting that alignment at a quarterly cadence perspective, I think we can do that very much offline with maybe a all hands meeting to come together and ta-da, I think we've done it. I think we've got a plan for our big ticket stuff.
Yeah.
I think it's a really... Mark, you go.
No, you go. You go. I've done talking.
There's a really good point in there, which is part of this is just encouraging the accountabilities that leaders hold. So, for example, if you need something from another leader, one of your peers or another team, you shouldn't need to bring, it would be a failing of the QBR for all of those conversations to have to route via a QBR, and need to be decided at QBR. You should pick up the phone and you should call the other team, and you should work on it. You should resolve any issues, capacity, and only if it's not resolved, only if you weren't able to solve the issue through collaboration, it might come into into the process where you can seek the support of the leaders above you to resolve it. And so a lot of this is about actually just encouraging leaders to take the accountability. That's why they're leaders leading in an organization. But it's providing the mechanisms of transparency when they're not leading and they're not collaborating, for those things to be made visible and to resolve them quickly. In one organization we worked with, which had 100,000 people, and we had all leaders of the leadership team, so two layers below the CEO, operating in their quarterly cadence. Anyone in the organization could bring, say, resource contention. If they didn't have the resources they need to achieve the outcome, they would resolve it through collaboration first, but then it could escalate all the way to the CEO and the leadership team. 95% of issues were all resolved in the process, but occasionally there'd be like one FTE, a service designer, needed for this outcome in some pocket of the business, and wouldn't be able to, if it wasn't resolved through that collaboration process, it would land with the leadership team, and that's a great discussion to have. But people will self-resolve stuff; they'll resolve it offline. But it's about creating that transparency and accountability for everyone. Just briefly, because Chris's questions, the open transparency, the point in the chat there, how do you get leaders to engage in this behavior? People don't, it's not natural for your goals, like a value stream. The goals are also the goals of the leader of that value stream. And it is not necessarily a norm to have them publicly visible, and the reflections on performance to the whole organization. However, it is something that can foster great alignment and really harness the power of the organization behind it. And so, often there'll be 5 reasons why we can't publish our goals. There might be market sensitive, goals somewhere hidden away, or confidential customer information may be hidden. And generally, pulling out those objections, working through them. Often people sort of give up at like objection number 2. Okay, we'll just stay in our silos. We won't make them transparent. But if you actually work through the objections of why couldn't we make our goals visible to all of our people, we've seen ASX 10, 20 companies make all of their goals, visible, or the majority, 95% of their goals visible, and have mechanisms to handle, market sensitive information and other things. And even 95% of the goals is just a massive win when you're trying to unlock, thousands of people's potential.
I appreciate you coming back to that question, Sam. I didn't want to push it because I thought it was taking us slightly off track from the core thing, but I just believe that so much. And maybe I took from your presentation as well that I can't remember who mentioned the shallow and deep, the shallow and broad, or the narrow. And like, I was thinking actually the same principles apply in, okay, let's go with open on this. And then you try and show the value, or you show the benefit, you show, because like it's human beings. If you can get that feedback loop going because it is visible, then others will see. And I resolved it in my head as, okay, with the transparency thing, you apply the same principle. And hope it catches.
Yeah, and there is a safety net required of like psychological safety. People will, they'll be fearful. The first objection is, I'm not going to achieve my goal. But that's the discussion that you want to be having in these cadences, and having a safe space where those can be managed and people can feel free to share is only going to be good for achieving, the outcomes.
And so to your point, Chris, around hopefully it catches, it will, because the benefits that will be given to that leader, to that team, with the transparency, with the understanding of the goals, that is the catch. And then other people will see the same and wonder how that's happening. And yeah, that's how, if you know the video of the crazy person dancing on the hill, there'll be more crazy people dancing on the hill because it'll come together.
But surely you would share that with use case stories at the end of a piece of work. And the piece of work doesn't have to be 3 months. We're seeing a lot of work coming into work streams, which will take 6 weeks because people can work a lot faster. They've got better direction from above. The stuff that you're saying that strategists and operational managers should be putting out is there in such a way that the living memo will show you where alignment is being made and where emergence is happening, so that the managers can then move quickly to update the target operating model and to keep things flowing much more quickly. The other thing with 3 months cadence at the moment is that the speed of update of large language models is roughly 3 months. You're getting a new one every 3 months. So business is always going to be behind where the technology is. And then if you do upgrade your large language model, you've got to re-index all your data so that you can ask the questions that you need behind it, which means that you're going to be 6 months behind in terms of the data that the teams are going to be searching for if they're using LLMs to make the decision-making faster. Sorry, I said too much. I'll stop. But thank you anyway. I really enjoyed that. As you can tell, it's triggered some good ideas. And
Thanks,
Bree,
Zach.
I love the jumper you've got there.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
It's more the organisation I work for.
It's like a honeycomb. Shows how people work together in reality.
Should we do one last question and then wrap it up, because we'll be at the top of the hour? Ruma's question's got some parts. Shall we go there? Ruma, did you want to pop yourself off mute?
Yep. Thanks, Maria. Hi, everyone. I'm curious to know, how do you measure the success of the quarterly cadence, the process itself, what you're doing, how you're doing, how do you know it's working well?
Eugene shared a slide before, just like you would treating, if you're building a product, a mobile app for the organization, you're going to ask for user feedback, or you should be asking for user feedback. Not everyone does. And so, how do you think about that feedback cycle with your key personas that engage in QBR? How do you engage them at the end to say, was this helpful? What decisions did the process unlock? What would we improve for next quarter? What you'll find is, once you sort of hit your stride with this, is you're most likely going to be actually designing iterations and improvements to the next QBR while the business is operating in the current QBR. So staying ahead of that, but having your ear close to the ground on, on feedback. And I think, that there's one, the process itself. Is it simple? How many people have engaged? If you've published these artifacts, for example, on Confluence or on SharePoint, how many views, how many people in the organization have actually come and checked out the goals? So there might be a number of hits, but ultimately, you want to be looking at, what decisions is this unblocked, and really, asking your key engaged users, and even the detractors, the people that are fighting against, that you feel are fighting against the process. engaging those detractors on what could we improve next quarter. I think are key things to be thinking through.
If I can add a few more. So if the starting point is, do you have visibility of the work? What % of the work is visible? And is it all the work? So I'm not just talking about the change, I'm talking about BAU work. I'm talking about the pet projects from the leaders that are handed down to teams to deliver. I'm talking about all the work. So what % of visibility of the work do we have? How much of the portfolio, if I'm thinking enterprise, are we representing? Have we decided to go narrow and deep with one business unit to start with, or do we have a good cross-section across all? What does that % look like? What coverage do we have? How many decisions have we made based on the information? How many insights have we derived from this? What has this allowed us to do? Have we matched demand with capacity? Is that 100%? Is that not? Why not? Those are the metrics that I would be putting on top of the ones Sam said in place.
Thank you.
All right, beautiful. I think there's a bit more in the chat. So shall we answer the things in the chat, team, before people go, if you want to hang around for those who've put in some comments. But otherwise, I think we might wrap it up because we are at the top of the hour. Thank you, everyone, for joining and participating and hearing today. I hope that has helped provide you a little bit of a structure, a little bit of a frame for how to think about it, why this is a challenge, what you might do about it, and how you might get started. And of course, the devil is always in the context. So this is a pattern to be applied and some details to be worked through. But thank you. Thanks, everyone.